The Anunnaki are leaving the false matrix, they're leaving humanity. You could even say they're abandoning, sounds kind of more if I say it that way. The Anunnaki are abandoning the false matrix. Why? And who are they? And why would they? And what is the false matrix? There's a lot to cover today, but we're going to hear a lot as I walk you through the story, and it's going to culminate in me being in a meeting with the Anunnaki when they signed off their agreement with humanity. So bear with all of this background information, because there's a very important and powerful message here. And the message is really, listen up. You have no idea how powerful you are. Honestly, you don't. And I'm going to share with you how humanity's spiritual awakening, which is to say, us waking up from the blurred vision of the false matrix that we lived in, us waking up from the forgetfulness that we were born to, how that has a direct implication on the Anunnaki. But let's start at the beginning, otherwise this is going to not make that much sense. And at the end, you might feel like I've left holes in the story and you can ask me questions. I hope that I don't, though. I really hope that I give you a thorough insight. Okay. Let's start. It's going to be quick, all right? You guys know, if you listen to me, you know how I speak. It's bam, bam, bam with the information. But there's a reason why, because there is actually so much here. And I'm trying my best to give it to you in a way that is as succinct as possible. But imagine trying to give you the history of humanity in a couple of minutes. It's an almost undoable process, but I'm going to do my best. Okay. Humanity, we're taught something, right? We're taught that we're made in the image of God or by God. And the truth, by Jove, the truth by God, is that we're not directly made from God, even though we're made of God. Hold on, what is she saying? Okay, there are a group of beings that control a realm. We live in that realm. That realm is called the false matrix. Those beings are called the Archons. The Archons are a group of beings who are truly depraved. They once played a very important role. The role that they played was to hold darkness for humanity, because in holding darkness, it catalyzes light. We came here to learn. We came here to evolve into light. Their role was once essential. Also, there's this grand experiment taking place of what happens inside our reality when we split light and dark into two separate carriers, not even the same being, but groups of beings were going to hold darkness, groups of beings were going to hold light. The groups that held the light, we called them the angelics, and they went on their own mission, you guys. The angelics fell from grace, the angelics regained their footing, they restored their integrity, and they have realigned. The group of beings who I'm talking about right now, the Archons, they've had a more difficult path. The path that they walked was one of separation. And eventually they became addicted to the separation because it gave them a sense of superiority. There's a video where I've covered this, in fact, a couple of videos where I've covered this more in depth. So I'm giving you bullet point form right now. The Archons, and I'll leave those videos, by the way, in the video description box. So the Archons became depraved and corrupted by the position that they once held, which was to hold darkness. There were a lot of beings who aligned to the Archons. So it wasn't just the Archons. Think of the Archons almost as an umbrella, and then a whole lot of species who kind of collectively colluded with the Archons, falling underneath that umbrella. The Archons themselves, they are not really physical beings. So when people say, oh, you know, these are the puppet masters on the planet, maybe they're the politicians. No, they're really not. They're not even on this planet. They're way too smart for that. They're a level of psychopathic genius that have kept us really in a frequency net fighting among ourselves. That's why they don't show themselves, because if we saw the real enemy, we might figure something out. So long as they remain in the background, we're always going to be pointing fingers at whatever we can see or conjure. So the whole idea was that they were never going to physically incarnate and interact in this reality. The Archons have merged with AI. They've merged with artificial intelligence because, again, remember what they're addicted to is superiority. What AI gave them was a sense of a vast intellectual superiority and the ability to quantum compute at a rate that they weren't able to with their natural intelligence. So that was a very addictive offering for them. And they're, of course, trying to implement exactly the same thing into our reality, where you see those agendas which are very obvious, where you can see that transhuman agenda playing out, the idea of merging humanity with a artificial type of intelligence. Now, that's further down the line, and we've all heard doom and gloom Armageddon type scenarios, because that's the way the false matrix was always going to end. See, the false matrix was the playground that the archons created. They could no longer play in the divine matrix, which is God's original creation template, so they made their own. The snag with that, though, is that because they separated themselves from God, they lost their ability to create. So this is where we come in, you guys, and it's also where the Anunnaki come in. They needed a slave species to populate the false matrix. We are that slave species. I know the questions, they're flying in your mind right now. They're like, how could God let this happen? And what is she talking about? Stick with me. I'm going to go fast, but at the end, hopefully this is going to give you an overview. And like I said, ask me questions in the comments. And if it's necessary, I'll come back and do a part 2 or 3 or whatever needs to happen. So the false matrix populated by, first, a couple of different trial and error type of humans. What's a trial and error type of human? Well, they're the humans who just didn't make it, like Homo erectus. You know, Homo sapien, the species that we are now. There's a question mark as to why are we the only survivors of the human species. There have been many different forms of humanoid species that have populated our planet in time, and there have been reasons that archaeologists have given us. Oh, this one didn't make it because they couldn't adapt, or this one couldn't make it because of whatever, the weather changed at the end of the Ice Age, or interesting bits of information like that. But the bigger picture is the archons employed a group of geneticists to hybridize their slave species. That's the trial and error human. Those are the multiple forms of humans that weren't quite right for what the archons had envisioned. What the archons had envisioned was to have a species that was controllable enough, that's us, but at the same time not totally docile. They needed a bit of pushback from the population, because when we resist and we push against and we fight against something, we perpetuate that. So they needed an element of, we're not totally docile, we're not totally stupefied, but partially, thus making the human species more easy to control. The human species, very importantly, had to have the DNA of what they call the master races. The master races DNA is the archons, beings like the Anunnaki. There are multiple other star beings, more than 20 of them, that colluded in this experiment that gave their DNA to the Anunnaki, who on behalf of the archons would create this, us, the hybridized species that we are. Oh my God, that's what happens when you don't put your phone on silent. I nearly jumped out of my skin, you guys. So I'm so wrapped in the story with you guys. We've got the slave species that the Anunnaki made, and on behalf of the archons, of course. And when we got to the point that they thought we'd never get to, this is when the problem started. The point that they thought we would never get to is our spiritual awakening. You see, when all of this was taking place, when this entire hybridization of the human species was taking place, there were a group of light beings that saw what was going on and said, that's not good. No, we cannot allow this to happen. But at the same time, the experiment called the false matrix already had, you could say, volunteers, applicants. There were souls that had already said, oh, I want to participate in that. I know there's your question. Why would anyone participate in this? Because from our perspective, getting out of the false matrix was very, very simple. I know it hasn't been simple at all, but from our perspective, before we came in, we thought it was going to be really easy to get out. But look, we didn't come in totally naive. We knew that we were coming into a minefield of manipulation. We understood the rules of the false matrix was that we were going to forget who we were, but we also understood that it was going to be impossible to stay in the forgetfulness forever or indefinitely. We understood that there would be a time of awakening, which is where we are right now. And they also understood something. And that was that interwoven into this genetic experiment was the star seed signature energy, meaning the angelics and multiple other beings of light inserted their DNA. They said, okay, you guys want to do that experiment. You want to create this slave species. Well then, because we can't stop it, it's free will, we can't intervene with free will. But what we can do then is insist that we be a part of that experiment, which was a big thing to insist upon, because it was going to bind them karmically, or it was going to bind them at a soul level to our process, to our evolution. But they were so committed to supporting the human journey that that's what they did. The geneticists, of course, working for the archons, they had an intention, which was, let's put that DNA in, that angelic DNA, that light DNA, what we think of when we think of star seeds, let's put that star seed DNA in, but we'll make it dormant. We'll put it there because we have to, but we'll make it so that the human beings can never access it. Well, guess what started to happen come 2012? For some of us even before, but around about 2012, mass awakenings started happening on the planet. People began waking up. Now's where it gets really, really interesting. Because I want you to see the power of your awakening. And I want you to understand what awakening means. Spiritual awakening is not enlightenment. It's not perfection. It is simply the beginning yawn. Awakening. You know, when you get out of bed in the morning, what do? That. But what it signifies is I am entering into a new consciousness. It is no longer the sleep state. I'm in an awakened state, right? Exactly the same thing is happening now at the energetic level, wherein we're not completely blinded, not complete in our forgetfulness and our amnesia. The awakening is the excitement within the DNA. Now is where that angelic and those light being codes come online. Suddenly people get epiphanies. Suddenly people start speaking light languages, or they start having gifts and telepathies and insights and radical healings that they don't even know where they came from. They're changing inside and they know it. And the world out there can lie and say nothing's happening. But for those who are awakening, they become their own source of information. They're no longer indoctrinated by the external sources of information. They become their own inner fountain of wisdom. And so they start tuning into themselves. Of course, they're going to get it wrong. Of course, they're going to stumble along the way. Of course, they're going to trip up. This isn't about they're perfect. This is more about they are yawning themselves awake. Awakening is an ongoing ripple effect, but that's what it is. It's a ripple. Once that ripple starts rippling, it doesn't stop. Now, quantum entanglement. Because the archons and those who worked for them, being the Anunnaki in particular, because they were arrogant at the time of the inception of this plan of creating a slave species, they imagined that we'd never wake up, and they knew the consequence. They knew the consequence. If we woke up, it was going to have a ripple effect on them. Our awakening would bleed into their reality, and they would spontaneously start to awaken, and they didn't want that. And the reason why they didn't want that, never wanted that, always avoided that, was because it would change their frequency that they were firmly established in. Remember what I said in the beginning? The depraved ones became so depraved that they became addicted to separation. They wanted to remain in density and darkness, essentially. Darkness refers to a set of frequencies that's just very dense and very heavy in energy. It's the energy of separation. They love that energy. They want to preserve it. It gives them a sense of superiority. For them, reunification with Source, which is our heaven, is their hell. Reunification with Source is the eradication of the personas that they've become addicted to. This is a deep psychosis that they're in, that they will invariably and inevitably awaken from, but right now they're stuck, and that's just where they are. So we've become a thorn in their side now. We've become a very uncomfortable ripple effect. We've rippled back into their reality. and they find themselves awakening. Now, what's interesting is the Anunnaki, we cannot look at the entirety of the Anunnaki and say, they're all bad. They're all the rots, the rotters, the hellhounds, the bad guys. We can't do that in the same way that we can't look at any gender and say men are like this and women are like that, and this race is like this and that race is like that, because we're generalizing. And yes, sometimes that generalization sticks. Sometimes we can say, and it can be true, the Anunnaki in general wanted to control humanity, but there was always a faction of the Anunnaki that did not. There was always a faction of the Anunnaki that came in to this experiment imagining that humanity was actually going to ascend and wanting for that to happen. There was always and still is that faction of the Anunnaki going, go Team Humanity, rah, 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 we're on your side. That still exists, and it's very, very beautiful that we have that level of support. So when I'm talking about the Anunnaki as a whole, I'm talking about the Anunnaki who initiated this hybridization program, this experiment that we are. That faction of the Anunnaki that really wanted the best for humanity, we call them by a different name, although they are Anunnaki, we call them by the name the Ancient Builder Race. The Ancient Builder Race populated not just our planet, they were scattered throughout our entire cosmic realm. And they've left the remnants. That's why we call them the ancient builder races. So when you look at pyramids, for example, and you look at the structures beneath the pyramids, for example, what you're seeing are the remnants of the ancient builder race, which is that part of the Anunnaki that only ever wanted the best for humanity. So the Anunnaki as a whole is who I'm referring to when I say there are those in the Anunnaki who cannot withstand the awakening. The separated faction of them, which are known as the Ancient Builder Race, they're evolving alongside us now. Here's where it gets really interesting. Guys, with time, I'm super bad. I'm lacking that faculty in my brain that helps me delineate the difference between what happened yesterday and what happened last week. It all gets kind of blurry for me. So when I give you time, this is very more or less. I reckon this was about 3-4 years ago, somewhere around there. I had an amazing interaction with the Galactics. The Galactics are a group of beings, 5D and beyond. I've been connecting with them since, well, pretty much for my whole life. Predominantly into adulthood is where our conversation became very, very intense and the training became very pronounced. But anyway, the Galactics, they called me into a galactic meeting, like I said, 3-4 years ago. And I could feel a sense of trepidation. I knew they were going to ask me to do something super challenging. And what we'd been working on and have been working on pretty much since my early 20s is this gift called sacred neutrality. It's the gift of alchemy. It's part of what I teach in my online community called the Plasma Light Tribe. It's a core teaching of what they taught me and what I teach humanity. Sacred neutrality is 2 words, 2 very small, simple words with a meaning so majestic, so powerful, so grand, so mystical that we can't even fathom the power of these 2 words. There is, in fact, an online container that I've created in my online community where people just go and sit in a room called the 0 Point Zone. They go sit in the sacred neutrality. They learn to anchor presence into that heightened state of awareness, and they learn to acclimate to it. And this is something that takes time. So the Galactics had been working with me many years, mastering this technique called sacred neutrality. So I knew that whatever they were going to ask me to do was going to give me this big energetic supercharge, because the challenge is, can you remain in sacred neutrality, which is absolutely not pushing down a feeling, it's not negating a feeling, it's learning to alchemize a feeling as it happens. I knew that I was going to be tested this day, and I certainly was. They said to me, okay, so what's happening is the Anunnaki, they're breaking their contract with humanity. They're leaving the false matrix. They're leaving this realm. They cannot stay any longer, because the longer they stay, the more our ripple, humanity's ripple that is, affects them. They do not want ascension. They do not want awakening. They do not want enlightenment. They do therefore want distance. And the truth is, I knew this then and I know it now, that there is no distance they can cover. But they're still figuring that out. There is no distance they can cover that is going to negate the effect of our awakening on them. Because remember, genetically, their stuff is inside of us. We cannot awaken ourselves without having a knock-on effect for them, right? That makes sense. So they're trying to go into a dimension, a different dimension where they can essentially shield themselves from us. But that's another story. So what the Galactics asked me to do was bear witness. Bear witness to this meeting with the Anunnaki, wherein they were going to, I want to put it this way, hand in their notice. It was very powerful. It was very, very sacred. I'll be honest with you, it was a little bit scary. It's, you know, this is a more real way of saying it. It was scary to my human mind. In the moment when I was with them in that meeting, these are massive beings. And, you know, I remember swimming with the dolphins for the first time, you guys. Bottlenose dolphins are pretty damn large. And I remember going, Kerry, they're not sharks. They're not going to eat you. But there's something that happens to us as a very primal response when we're in the presence of a very big-bodied being. We do get a little bit intimidated. It was an intimidating process, but there I was, baby, breathing in my sacred neutrality so I could witness the journey of their departure. That was it. That was my role, was just to bear witness as a human representative. Now, it was not at the energetic level. This was a physical meeting that took place in a bilocation station. And what that is a place almost like a reality out of phase with this world. So think of it as a bubble of reality that nobody else could see and permeate and penetrate, because it's a separate container within the planetary realm. So actually, that was quite significant that it took place on planet Earth in a contained space. It needs to be, you guys, because energetically they leave a trail of energy that we do not want to be in the presence of, and equally they also didn't want to be exposed to the presence of the awakening consciousness. And isn't it amazing that it was that spoke to them the loudest? Humanity's awakening. That's when they looked at humanity, is what they saw. They don't watch CNN. They don't watch mainstream news. They were at one stage the ones who were participating in a mass, can we call it a mass hypnosis program, feeding humanity information. They're certainly not going to be watching that stuff. What we see on the news is, oh, all the war, all the mayhem, all the chaos, all the disaster, all the reasons to panic, all the reasons to fear, all the stuff that's going wrong, all the pollution, all the toxins, all the ways in which humanity is bad, bad, bad. That's what we see on the news. Therefore, our perspective of ourselves becomes very tainted. Their perspective of humanity is, damn it, those guys are powerful. They did the unthinkable. They did what we thought they were never capable of doing. They were so sure of themselves. These are some of the highest minds coming together to create a species, to concoct a plan, to have a false matrix that would self-perpetuate, because a false matrix needs a population of slaves to perpetuate it, to continually create and keep it afloat, keep it alive. Without the slave population, there is no false matrix. It cannot be sustained on its own. So they had taken all of this into account. Never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that we were capable, that you were capable of this level of love, of wisdom, of greatness. And I want to share with you that you do not know. You don't get it. You don't get your power, but I wish that you did. And maybe you've got a waft of it. Maybe you've got a little glimmer of it somewhere. May it grow and may it expand, and may you know that you are such a phenomenal force in the universe. Wait until at the DNA level, wait until all of that angelic signature energy, wait until all the light beings, until their signatures start coming online. That's what's happening. You know, we talk about DNA activation. That's what's happening right now. It's like the one is activating, the other is activating, the other is activating the other. There will be more beyond the Anunnaki. Remember I said the Anunnaki work under the umbrella of the Archons with multiple other races that have been working to maintain the false matrix. So the Anunnaki are the first guys that pulled out although this happened a couple years back, I did actually make a video about it. It was just kind of a very old, slow, crappy video, so I knew it needed an update, which is why I've made this one now. But I've also made this one now because there are more beings in the process of pulling out of their contracts. And that is supremely exciting. And no, just in case there's confusion, we don't need them to, we don't need this. This isn't for us. This does not make us ascend now or make the false matrix collapse now. They weren't the reason that the false matrix was being upheld. We were. They weren't the reason that we were enslaved for so long. We were. They set the trap. We maintained the trap, essentially. So whether or not they left the false matrix and their agreements with the false matrix, that was never going to hinder our ascension. So I don't want you to have this subservience and this disempowerment that says, oh, phew, it's because because they're leaving that I'm okay now. That's not the case at all. They're leaving because you're okay. They're leaving because they can't maintain themselves in your presence. So what does that teach you about how to deal with people who are difficult in your world? Maybe you've got a bugbear, somebody who's really difficult to deal with. People always talk about all these narcissists and these very difficult people in the world. What do you realize now about how powerful you really are? Your light creates your reality for you. Your light goes out ahead of you. And it sets up a field, a frequency that others cannot enter when they are lower than and lesser than the frequency that you're anchoring in. You don't need to push people out of your reality. You only need to hold your light. You don't need to break the false matrix. You only need to hold the divine matrix within you, and it emanates from you, and it begins to crumble. It begins to crack at the seams of the false matrix. So from my heart all the way to yours, whew, baby, what a thrill to share this information with you again in an updated version. Share it with a friend that needs to know that we're so much further ahead than we've ever dared to dream. This is me sending you love. This is me reminding you that your heart is a beautiful open landscape filled with light. And the more light you let in, the more light ripples and radiates out. I hope you feel that. I hope you feel the love that you are. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye for now.